I watch the New York Times or the Washington Post, let alone lesser papers, to take an example from right now. The losing army, desperate to hold on to whatever support it can get from the West, takes a group of its military, which it has a shortage of, and makes a break into an undefended part of Russia. Of course, if you're following, that's pointless, it's hopeless, has nothing to do with war. The desperation is written all over it. It'll be over in 2 weeks. But the Ukrainians are showing, what are you doing? Are you crazy? Now, I read French and German newspapers. I have an advantage. With the internet, I can read in my own other languages as easy as I can pick up an American paper. They don't make that mistake. So I have a whole nother network of sources. They make mistakes too, it's not that. But I'm not. Look, here it is, the level of propaganda is horrific. But people should remember, propaganda, like everything else, rises and falls. You need propaganda. In the middle of a war, you need to mobilize your people, so the enemy is an awful, horrible monster beast, and you are beautiful vanilla. I get that. But we all get it, right? We understand in a war you have to kind of, look, we're all together. So we don't expect all that much. But there's a pattern to propaganda, which the literature on this subject has made very clear. And one of the key sources of propaganda is weakness, you're losing the situation, and you comfort yourself, just like eating too much or 100 other ways that we comfort ourselves if we're under too much stress. For a country that had 75, maybe 100 years of global dominance, certainly since the Second World War, but even earlier, but certainly since so that's a long, 75 years roughly, right? So total dominance. I mean, nobody was close. I explained to people, because I'm an economist, the Soviet Union was never an economic competitor of the United States. I give them a statistic. I'll give it to you now, because Americans don't know, because they could find it out in 2 seconds. What is a GDP? You know, the GDP gross, right? It's a rough economics measure of the size of an economy, the footprint, the total output of goods and services in a calendar year. So the GDP of the United States right now, $24 trillion. The GDP of Russia right now, $1.5 trillion. Do you understand? To think of the Soviet Union as an economic competitor means you're ignorant. It's as gross as saying you and that very little midget dwarf person who got stunted by something, who's only 3 feet tall, are no different. What? You're no different. Stop. Whatever else are you, he could be brilliant or she could be, but there's a difference, not in the United States. Mentality can't handle it. China is the new empire. I mean, that's it. It's over. It's been over for 10, 15 years, and it becomes more over every minute. It's a phenomenon that is in no way hidden and in no way difficult to discern. Give you an example. This year, like every one of the last 30, the GDP is growing faster in China than here, usually double or triple. This year, the United States will grow 2.5%. China will grow 5%. That's the normal relationship. It's been going on for a generation. I mean, it's over. It's just over. There is a question. The Chinese say they don't want an empire. Now, on the one hand, that could be unbelievable wisdom. Could be. Especially in China, because they had an empire once. They actually are looking at the second time. The United States never had that as a new situation. They want a multipolar world. Xi Jinping says it. He says it repeatedly. And he doesn't say it with a twinkle in his eye. Doesn't mean it's going to happen, but maybe we're on the cusp of a different way of organizing the world. We don't have the American Empire, the British Empire, the Dutch Empire, Persian Empire, Greek Empire, Roman Empire. Maybe not, but the American Empire is over. And there's no precedent here. Nobody has prepared the American people. What do you do if the ride up, which was a good ride for 75 years, rising standard of living, people like me went to Harvard, people like you go to Stanford, blah, blah. I mean, I don't know your background, but whatever it is, all of these things are now. And it comes from the change in the world economy. The G7, you know the G7, okay? The G7, US and its major allies, is now a smaller aggregate GDP than the BRICS, China and its allies.
And which are the BRICS for our listeners who don't know?
Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. That's the original BRICS, they're 20 years old. And they have recently been joined by 6 other countries, including Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and some others. And there are about a dozen that have applied, more or less. So the BRICS is already aggregate GDP larger than the G7. You know, why is this important? Because every country's leaders, whether they are right-wing, left-wing, they're all readjusting to what? To the changing world economy. If you're a small African country and you need to build a railroad, it used to mean you would go to London, New York, Paris, and hope and ask and see if they'll bring their bankers to meet with you and you could arrange a loan to develop your country. If you're having trouble selling your products, where would you go? If you have your trouble buying, where would you? Now everybody has a second option. You don't have to go west, you go east. Go to New Delhi, go to Beijing. Why? They have more money. It's not, it doesn't have nothing, I'm exaggerating, but it doesn't have much to do with ideology. So, but not much. It has to do with a changing world economy. And even if you're a partisan of one or the other, you don't want to be left out of, you know. Emmanuel Macron, the leader currently of France, who's on his way out today, his people have rejected him totally. But before that happened, he made noises he wanted to join the BRICS. They turned him down, by the way. You know, they don't need him. The Americans don't get it. Look, when the war in Ukraine breaks out, the Russians invade Ukraine, the United States decides that the way to handle this, to defeat the Russians quickly, is by imposing on them the greatest, the mother of all sanctions. We won't buy Russian oil and gas. Russia depends heavily on oil and gas, which it has a lot of, and exporting it to Europe, which is a consumer and doesn't have much. Perfect relationship. By the way, if you understand modern Europe, it's the core of modern Europe's economic success. Cheap Russian energy. And that flows directly, until they blow up the pipeline, to Germany. Okay. So Germany becomes, in German, you know a little German with your philosophy?
A little bit.
Okay. So Germany has, after the war, which decimates it, a Wirtschaftswunder, which is German for miracle of economics, the recovery of Germany. Germany becomes the economic powerhouse of Europe. Okay, a lot of truth to that, but a dependence on cheap Russian oil and gas. Okay, so the plan is we won't buy it anymore from you. You'll collapse. The ruble will collapse. Your country will fall apart. Not only will you lose the war in Ukraine, but the West will come and carve you up into Moldavias, dozens of them, which could never be any more important than what we call those Kazakhstan, those countries. That's serious. Biden speaks that way. Blinken, the state secretary, speaks that way. Jake Sullivan, the security advisor, they all speak that way. They believed that. That was all wrong. Russia didn't collapse. The ruble is fine. Yeah. What happened? They didn't understand the change in the world because they're lost in the make-believe that it's not over. They didn't understand BRICS. What did the Russians do? They went to their allies, Russia and China. Will you buy the oil that we can't sell to Europe? Done. Deal. No problem. Game over. Now, why did you say to yourself, as historians will, they couldn't see this coming? They don't know what you know? Of course they know. But it's like Harvard when I was a student. You don't want to see that. That's not cool. Nobody wants to hear the leader of our country saying, "Ooh, the empire is over." My agenda is to work out a way to decline that preserves the things we care about. I use the following example. When the United States, as a corner colony of Britain, decides it wants to do things its own way, okay? The British come down and say, you can't. And the Americans, half of them take it, the other half are pissed off. So we have the Tea Party in Boston. I mean, exaggerating, simplifying. So then we have a war. But it's very important. The British go to war against the United States, their own colony, to say to the colony, you are not going to go your own way. You're going to do what we tell you. George III, king, sits in England, and George Washington sits here. And the British, to everybody's amazement, including George Washington's, lose the war. 1812, they try again. They fail again. And they reach a conclusion. We can't prevent it. And so they work out a live and let live deal with their colony, even though they're competitors in many ways. We can work something out, and they do. That will become the American strategy toward China. But it's not speakable yet. And the first politician who says it, and says it clearly, will be the next president, because it'll be understood, however bitterly, as the best way to go, as it was in England. They didn't like it, they hated it, they bemoaned it, then they did it. And this country will too, because what the fuck is the alternative? Nuclear war? Really? You won't do that? Endless of these proxy wars? And by that I include the one in the Middle East, about to explode. Absurd games in the South China Sea around Taiwan. So I think all of these are, to bring it back, consequences flowing out of a changed world economic arrangement, which can be summarized in a lot of ways: the arrival of the BRICS, the emergence of China, the decline of the American empire. There are a lot of different ways of categorizing or characterizing what's going on, just as there are many ways in which it shapes the American consciousness. I think Americans are very distressed. They get it. There's a reason why MAGA is the slogan. Why? Make America great. They know that there was something lost. And glib comments. People always think, it's greener on the other side, it's greener in the past. Yeah, it is a little bit automatic, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. That doesn't mean you're done with your analysis when you can show people are grabbing onto some manner of speaking. They're also expressing something running real deep in them, that they know. The war in Vietnam, forget everything else. It was lost. We lost. The war in Iraq, we lost. The war in Afghanistan, we lost. The war in Ukraine, we lost. Holy mackerel, what is that? That's what happens with empires when they overreach. They can't do it. If you go back and you read Gibbon or anybody else on the decline of the Roman Empire, it was these what did they call them? Vandals, barbarians coming from the Central European steppes that were, ripping apart the Roman Empire. Well, it doesn't take a genius. There were plenty who did good work there, but it doesn't really take a genius. The reason the foreigner can grab your stuff is because you can't stop them. Come on. We sent 500,000 people to Vietnam. We lost. It's a communist country. The Taliban runs Afghanistan. I mean, you need more information? And yet, when I give speeches in the United States, and I do this on purpose, and I reach a certain point, I have a pregnant pause, I lean over the podium, and then I say, and then the war in Vietnam was lost. The United States was beaten. You should see the faces. I wish I had a camera, capture my audience. They don't know what to do. By that time, I made a decent impression. I'm a bit of a stand-up comedian. I make jokes. I try to make the lecture. It's American audience. They used to TV, so I try to be entertaining. But at that moment, I catch them. It's not that they don't agree, although many don't. But it's not that. It's just there's something shockingly. I use a sexual metaphor. It's not that we don't know what's behind the clothing, but when a person takes their clothing off, there's a moment of sort of shock because we've all grown up in a society that says that's not the way it's supposed to be. It's not the appropriate thing. You're supposed to have a top and a bottom, particularly the bottom, and then we're not supposed to see. We all know what's there. Half of us because it's what we got, and the other half because we've been interested in what the other one got, and we have figured it out. So what is this all about? That's what this is. This is, we kind of know. We kind of know the empires. We kind of know, but we don't. We do not want to hear it. In a way, I think, if I can push it a little, that Trump was the first to cash in on this. There's something terribly wrong in this country, and I'm not like the others who pretend it isn't there. I'm not Bush, the Republican. I'm not Clinton. Everything's okay, and we're going to be all right, and everything is good. I'm not that. I'm going to say naughty things. I'm going to, Mexicans? Who want Mexicans? They're all rapists. I mean, inappropriate things, stupid, inappropriate, ignorant, biased. And by that act, he becomes one of the people who've been saying such things at the bar for years and over the dining room table in their family and at the workplace, and angry that the politicians can't or won't admit it, even though they're afraid to say so. I think they loved him for that. Many still do. But you know something? That goes nowhere. Never did. And so they don't want that anymore. They're enough with that. And the poor Trump, he's going right down the tubes now because he's stuck with the persona that had its moment, but is now, it's over. It doesn't compute. It doesn't do. People are really frightened more and more. They want a cheery person. They got one. And they're going to go for her because she's cheery. She's happy. She's energetic. This image of the two old men, in a race to see whose cognitive decline will be quicker, was just the worst. That's the image of the empire. Those two old men having trouble walking up an incline. Jesus Christ, this is it. She's brown and she's going to do it. And he's a nice guy with a nice smile, coaches football, teaches, likes working people. This is much better now. By the way, this will wear out just as fast as MAGA. And then, I hope, somebody will come along and say, hey, we need to make a deal between the rich and the poor, and they both are going to have to We're going to ease the pain. What we've had if I were writing the speech, what we've had so far is we've had the rich and the powerful in a declining empire using their wealth and power to hold on to what they got. And you know what that means? They're offloading the cost of a declining empire on the middle and lower classes. That can't go on. I'm the champion. But I'm saying to the rich and powerful, we're going to take a chunk of what you got. But if we don't, then everything will be lost. And they'll buy it, because they'll be by that time frightened by enough Ukrainians that they'll buy it. Or they won't. And if they won't, then they'll have to have a straight-out fascist to hold on to the middle and the bottom. And that's over then, too, which kind of they also know. So they're in a very tough place. I won't be around to see it. You will. But it's a tough place.
Okay, let me give you a break there again. A number now of regions and topics to discuss, but I'd actually like to talk about America in a context that hasn't come up yet. And it has come up to the extent that we discussed your global background and the indirect ways in which the Holocaust affected your life. And I guess the reason that this stuck out to me is that I also recently spoke with Norman Finkelstein again, who's another historian, though he isn't as focused on economic dimensions to history recently, and his entire family was decimated by the Holocaust as well. And it's interesting that he's Jewish and people don't, or a lot of people don't believe that it is consistent for Jews to be in support of Palestine.
Right.
But one dimension about the American empire and the dying American empire that I'd like to talk about or hear your thoughts on is our role in Israel and why we are so desperately clinging to this alliance and what the Middle East means to us going forward.
I want to try to answer it by being philosophically and historically sensitive to the issue. The United States projects onto Israel its own situation, and vice versa. Now, we all do that. I mean, projection, if you study psychology, you know, is a major thing. We can see in others what we often cannot see in ourselves, and we begin to try to work on problems we have by working on them when we notice them in other people. And then it often comes as a shock when the other people say, after a certain difficult moment, you're projecting. In other words, throwing it back on you. So let me explain. Israel can only exist in the long run, I suspect, and I know they suspect it too, by eliminating the Palestinians, either physically, which is a horrible thought for people who were victims of genocide to become perpetrators of it, that even for the right-wingers there who talk like that, must be some difficulty there somewhere. Or by pushing them out, or by expelling them so they go to Egypt or Syria or Lebanon or somewhere else. And that means for them, the United States, and people have to face this even though it's hard, is a model. We did it. We Americans did it. What's left of the indigenous population here? We killed them almost all. And the few that remain live in horrific conditions in what we call reservations scattered across the country. There's hardly anything left of culture, languages. I know they preserve them, they try hard, but For most people, the word Navajo means turquoise jewelry, if it means anything at all. So we're the model. If the Israelis weren't afraid of what it would sound like and what it might do to their support here, they would say that. They would say, who are you? You Americans are telling us we shouldn't do what you did. To which the answer is history. Yeah, we did it at a time when you can get away with that. You can't. So, I mean, it's useless as a model. It's not doable at this point. And now vice versa. Israel is a model for the United States. What is it doing? It's trying to hold on to a colonial situation. The epithet that many use against Israel, that you are an example of settler colonialism, that's correct. That's right, they are. They're not different in that way from Rhodesia or South Africa. And what happened to all of them? Whoops. Israel is arguably one of the last remaining settler colonialisms where the fight is still going on between the settlers and the people they displaced. The first book I wrote, published by Yale University Press, was a book version of my doctoral dissertation, which was a study of settler colonialism in the East African country of Kenya. It's now a standard, but if you're going to do an economic history of Kenya, and my book is among those you'd look at. I went to Kenya, I went to the British Museum where the data were, and I'm a good economist, a lot of data, full of tables in there. I mean, I did the work. But it's over. You know, the Mau Mau rebellion in the 50s effectively ended settler colonialism. The United States sees itself in Israel.
Richard, before we go on, just because it is such a contested issue, and I don't want to get totally derailed with it, but since you're an expert on it, I feel that I ought to ask just why you think of Israel as a colonialist state, because there is facially this argument that it once belonged to them and to Jews, and they're returning. So how do you respond to, I mean, there are many vocal people who disagree with this view.
Yes, I understand, absolutely. But you know, the Bible is a collection of stories that people wrote at various times and then made into a holy book. A lot of religions do that. They have books and people write them, and then they ennoble them. You know, there's the Quran and the Bible, and there's a lot of others. And I understand people can kill each other over the contents or interpretations of the books. But the human race has been all over the place all the time. Everybody can go anywhere and call it the right of return. Come on, I mean, what? There's a dispute over who the indigenous people were in what we now call the Western Hemisphere. There's an argument, for example, that at one time there was a land bridge linking what is now Alaska with Russia, and on the other side of the Bering Sea up there. Okay, on that theory, which has lots of support, we are all Asians. Till the Chinese arrive and say, hey, this is ours. We're coming back. We shouldn't have gone across there. We were hounded by evil. Stop. I mean, yes. Is there a story to be told here? Yes. This was once peopled by. But are you going to kill each other over real estate? Really? Stop. We're talking about the planet, people who have moved around the planet. We are all one theory in anthropology is we're all descended from what would have been a black female skeleton, I believe found in Kenya by Leakey and the people that worked with him who unearthed all these things. So we're all Africans? What? I mean, at some arbitrary point, you say, okay, I'm not going to anymore deal with movement. I'm going to start there. They were there then. Yeah, but they weren't always there then. They were somewhere else. And if you want to start at the beginning, then we're all Africans, which all these people will agree, oh, I don't want to do that. So I find all of this understandably, desperately trying to rationalize a difficult situation. The missionaries who came to Africa believed, and I think sincerely, that they were bringing wisdom, religion, salvation, and modernity to backward people, doing them an immense service, allowing them to leap over transitional periods that would have been difficult and painful at best. I understand it. But I also understand what the word rationalization has come to mean in psychology and in history. And I think it is, here's where I get bitter. I think it's criminal to cover over some, to make it crystal clear. I found it horrible what Hamas did on October 7th. Horrible, horrible. I put it in the context of a long struggle. I remember, because I've been interested, that every war that Israel fought until now was short and justified on the grounds that that's the way we protect against a horrible thing happening to us. And I began thinking by the 1970s, after the 67 war, that this argument didn't look too good because it wasn't protecting against horrific continuing acts. October 7th is the culmination of that thought in my mind. If ever you wanted a demonstration that all of the previous time, I don't know if you're familiar, but with the earlier, shorter wars, the Israelis would proudly say toward the end or at the end, X number of Israelis were killed, and X multiplied by 10 or 20 or 30 was the number of them that we killed. And when we're told, gee, that's nothing to be proud of, we were told that's to make sure it doesn't happen again. You know, it's like the United States dropping nuclear bombs in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Why? To save lives. Lives would have been cost if we had to invade, so now we didn't have to invade, we dropped the bomb. And yes, they're horrible, but much less than this kind of logic. Okay, for me, that's what all of this is about. October 7th is a horrible slaughter to be condemned as such, but it is also the proof, and it should be recognized, that this plan, which they're now continuing, is a very bad plan. It doesn't work. History doesn't work like that. You don't do it. That's make-believe. That's like saying, umpteen generations ago, there was these two guys that were living here, so I'm coming back. I mean, I get it. I understand. This is a game. Like, this will prevent more violence in the future. Or the Americans, who have 800 bases right now around the world. No other country has anything like that. We have 800 bases around the world, and the rationale, if we don't fight them over there, we'll be fighting them over here. Okay, this is the same thing. Again, it doesn't work like that. Believe me, if and when the shit happens here, all of that argument will stop being made because it will be shown what it is. So for me, I think what the Israel has done since is, like most people in the world, horrific. I mean, Americans, again, seem to have the ability, after the UN says this is a genocidal situation, to believe that this is all, no, you have to pay attention to it. Okay, don't pay attention. Doesn't go away because a 3-year-old child confronted by a scary dog puts his hands in front of his eyes because he believes that if he can't see the dog, it's not there. Then, as the child grows older, he realizes, you do this, the dog's still there. We can pretend, but the rest of the world, and if Israel, takes the next step with the United States, without it, with Britain and France, without them, and goes to war with Iran, they're going to make an unbelievable mistake. And I don't know whether you and I will be able to have conversations after such a mistake. But yeah, I understand the argument, but for me, this is a classic example of ex post rationalization, trying to find in a difficult situation. And I'm a Hegelian again in that way. I think when people tell that story, biblically, who were here once, it's because it's where they do recognize they've got a problem. They were put there, and the Palestinians were kicked out. And the British said, go ahead and do this, who had no authority or right to do it. So the British and the Zionists got together, did this thing at the expense of the Palestinians. Everybody knows that. And you can tell whatever story. That's what happened. And I think that the Israelis, I want to give them credit, even if they don't want it. I think they know that. And I think they're needy of it. Just like the Trump supporters, there's an empathy I have for them. They're suffering. Who wants to go backwards? They know somewhere. What are you talking? Backward? You really want to be like your grandpa? You don't. You want to go back, but you don't really. You don't want to go back very far. And they know. They're not stupid. Not at all. So what this is a little compromise people make with themselves that a clever politician or an instinctual one can play on. That's what this is.
Focusing on the economic undercurrents that you said motivate and inform both your understanding of history and current events, I'm curious about the role specifically of this particular region of Israel and Palestine, and then the larger Middle East, and how this functions in this conflict between G7 and BRICS and the loss of the American empire to China.
Yeah, well, I think you're seeing a coming together in the Middle East of a number of things. The first and most importantly, in my opinion, is the end of colonialism. That's bigger than the end of the United States because it's the end of the British and the French, the German. They all had empires, many of them with outposts in the Middle East. If you look at the history, France, key in Syria, Lebanon, Germany, and Turkey, and other places, Britain everywhere. And then all of them wiped out in the Second World War heavily and replaced by the United States, which become. The others are still there, but replaced by the United States. So that area of the world is part of a revolution that really starts in the first half of the 20th century and then really takes off in the second half and continuing. And that is a rejection of being a colonial subordinate. Not finished, not by a long shot. One big struggle happened in the first half of the 20th century when they kind of got themselves together and I'm exaggerating, but simplify. The people there understood they're going to have a big fight to get out of this. Second half, they took the first big step, political independence. Now, in the 21st century, they're dealing with the economic independence, which they do not have. And they're bitter. Bitter because many of them didn't understand that political independence doesn't go within in other words, no necessary. You can be as dependent economically after independence as you were before. Political independence, parliamentary government is a bit of a mirage. They weren't leftist enough. If they had been more leftist, they would have understood that the corporations can buy the political system if they need to and want to, and that can render the government a shell, a front, puppets, sort of like we have here. You know, if you look, the best example I can think of, if you look at a number of major issues that the Gallup or other polling companies regularly monitor, overwhelming majorities believe what the Congress does not do. Majority of people don't want the Ukraine war, don't want to spend all that money. Probably by now a majority don't want to support Israel, or certainly a large number don't. And a huge majority, because this I study, are in favor of a less unequal United States. They would like there to be a smaller gap between rich, much smaller than there is, and on and on and on. Majority want a higher minimum wage. A majority want a majority. They don't get any of it. And they know that. And they're angry with Republicans. You didn't do what you promised, and they vote Democrat. Then they get angry at the Democrats. You didn't do what you promised. It's all true. They promised it, and they didn't do it. And the interesting thing is that the reality is that political independence is a shell if you don't have economic independence. Or to say the same thing domestically, political democracy is a veneer if you don't have economic democracy, and we don't. Every business in this country, with very few exceptions, every factory, every office, every store, has a tiny group of people at the top who have all the power. The board in a corporation or a major form of business, a corporate board of directors, typically 15 people, between 10 and 20, but 15, good average. But they decide what to produce, how to produce, what technology to use, where to do it, and what to do with the revenue. The rest of us are employees. We make none of those decisions, nor do we have any power to decide who makes them. The shareholders do that. Shareholders are not employees, and vice versa. So we don't have a democratic system, and therefore that pollutes or undermines the claim to democracy. So when Kamala Harris gets up there, or any of the others, and they're preserving democracy, the only thing one can do is grin. You are doing a magic trick. You are preserving something that isn't there. Okay. Anyway, the problem, therefore, the first problem for the Middle East is that they don't have economic independence, nothing remotely like it. The only country with a little bit of exception to that, just a little, is Israel. Why? Because of their peculiar relationship, A, to Jews, and B, to the United States, which gives them a whole lot of money for nothing, just out of a kind of solidarity. You are our baby. You are our friend. You are our fellow Jew. You are our whatever, however they conceptualize it. There's a load of opportunity, cash, business deals, all kinds of things that are available to them through that contact that are not available yet to the others. BRICS may equal that game. That is, BRICS may, not yet clear, become a source of that kind of support either for selected other countries in the Middle East, which is already beginning to be the case. For example, Iran, which is why for Israel this is such a problem. Iran has, by being a BRICS member now, but also by dint of a very carefully followed policy, has now built relationships between itself, Russia, its neighbor, and China, that you can see the U.S. attempt to smash Russia is defeated by BRICS. That's that sanction story I told you. And Iran, we'll see if Israel and Iran now enter into a war, what kind of support Russia and China will give. My guess is it will surprise everybody, just the way the support for Ukraine, for Russia in the Ukraine war has surprised everybody. But for the moment, the Middle East is in a terrible place because they have political independence. They do not have economic dependence, which means they're either terribly poor and dependent on very few resources, or they have oil, which means they're dependent on that. And they're dependent on a global oil system that they cannot control. They're much too small. The only one who can do that a little is Saudi Arabia, and it doesn't want to share that position. The overcoming of the fight between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which was achieved by the Chinese, important hint, that changes the equation because that gives it the chance for a unity. The chance, no guarantee, the chance for a unity across what was a very divisive thing, because, you know, that's not just the unity of two major countries, and it's not just the unity of two major oil producers. It is the unity of Sunni and Shia within the Muslim. That very, 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 very important. That the Chinese did that, and that they understood all that, should be an enormous message to the West. Completely blew right by. The need in this country not to see what was achieved. And now, to be fair, most of what Iran has done has been the consequence of American policy. I think the Iranians would have been willing to cut deals with the United States. The Americans lost the opportunity. They didn't. When Trump canceled the arrangement with Iran early in his thing, that was a terrible misjudgment, and that has been kept going. That I just recently read a very nice article, very well done. You know who Zbigniew Brzezinski was? The advisor to Bush and the others. Big Polish, but American, big anti-Soviet. His whole thing before he died was the importance of the United States making an arrangement with Iran. And his great enemy were the neocons who wanted to destroy Iran. And that he died having lost that battle. The neocons have been in charge, and they have, and that drove Iran into where it is, as it did with Russia and China, bringing them together. Very, very, very dangerous for the United States. So anyway, you have the interaction of not wanting to be a colony, then the interaction of wanting desperately to find a solution to their economic dependence, now being offered a place in the BRICS. The Israelis unable or unwilling to try to find a place for themselves in the BRICS means that they're on the edge or out of it altogether. That's a whole new situation, because before, Israel was alone with a patron, the U.S. None of those countries had a comparable patron. Even if you had a patron of Russia, which they didn't, but even if you had it, remember what I told you. Russia is this economically, the United States is this. If you remember those numbers, Russia with a 1.5 trillion, United States with 23. Well, what's the GDP of China? 17, 18 trillion. So they are in the running, and they're getting closer every day. Russia's not. And with Russia and China together and Iran, then you have them as the patron. That's part of what this war is about. That patron is becoming important for all the smaller countries. They all, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, they're looking and they're seeing Egypt, Iran, Saudi Arabia are now with Russia. They know where their future is. Right there it is, right in front of you. You have to come to, and they're doing that. They're applying. They want to get in there. That's leaving Israel more and more. And the last thing is that the greatest representative of the colonial master isn't the old empires. Those have been defeated. They all got independence. It's the new one, the economic monster from which we did not get independence, which is global capitalism, which is represented, or was, by the United States. So Israel is the United States for them. And by the United States making Israel its partner, or whatever the language is, you are telling the Muslim world, if you hate Israel for all the religious reasons or the Palestine story or whatever, then the United States that's them. You know, Israel is the 51st state, or however they talk about it. It's a kind of every time Mr. Biden gets up and says, we will be with Israel all along, it's one more nail in the coffin, man. It does not, you have to be blind not to understand. And that's true not just in the Middle East, but in the whole Muslim world. That goes to Indonesia, Pakistan, or any of the other major Muslim countries, not to speak of Africa, or the growth of Islam in Latin America, all of which are significant. There's a level here. Here's the irony. The United States, after World War II, developed a commitment to things that were either called containment or some other kind of policy to isolate Russia, Soviet Union, or to Eastern Europe, or now to isolate. You know who's getting isolated? We are. It's the person who's busy painting everything in their environment, and then they end up in that, like in the cartoon, they've painted themselves into a corner. We're not isolating others, you stupid fuck. We're isolating us. That's come on, it's the Hegelian moment. You recognize always the other lurking. The boundary of whatever it is what separates you from the other. And the boundary being on both means the other is with you through the how hard is that? But we don't teach Hegel in the United States. By the way, there was no course on Hegel at Harvard.
Not at Stanford either, really.
No. The only place when I was interested in really doing this were Catholic schools. The Catholic schools in America had courses on Hegel. I think because they took philosophy, if you're going to read, I don't know, Thomas Aquinas or St. Augustine or all the other greats of that tradition, you realize they were the big people for Hegel and Kant and Fichte and Schelling and all the rest, and now you understand. Anyway, no Hegel. It's either right or wrong. It cannot be both.
You used this word blinded with great vigor a couple of minutes ago, and I don't think that I am blinded to this particular conflict as much as I am just woefully ignorant. And the one that I have in mind is that between Ukraine and Russia. There is so much to study, so much to read about, and it's just one that I haven't spent much time with. But I did see the headlines this weekend that you referenced earlier, that Ukraine has made this valiant incursion into Russian territory. And as somebody who is woefully uninformed, you labeled this as propaganda. It didn't occur to me that it was propaganda. I just sort of tacitly assumed, it's the news. Ukraine is about to win this war and somehow Russia is on its heels.
Yeah.
And so let me just ask if you could, I found that answer about Israel's role in this dispute between the G7 and the BRICS very helpful. What is Ukraine's role in this dispute between the G7 and BRICS, and what's going on with this conflict right now, and why why are people thinking or saying that Ukraine is winning now?
Okay. Some great journalist, I think it was, made a crack, which has become widely well known. You've probably heard it. And it goes like this. The first casualty in every war is the truth. Wars being what they are have motivated lots of people, not just America, but all kinds of people all around the world, to start telling monstrous make-believe. And again, there are many motivations. No leader of a war wants to be the loser, because that's usually the end of your career. So you got to be the winner. And no one wants to hear about the lost battles. They want to hear about the valiant achievements. And that's usually on both sides. So you should be, you really should be, deeply skeptical of anything that sounds like an official assessment of something in a war, unless it is so lopsided, the war, that one side doesn't need it, doesn't need the public. It's not that they wouldn't do it. It's not that they haven't done it, but they don't need it this time. Anyway, in this case, I think you have a little bit of the propaganda on both sides, a bit more on the Ukraine than on the Russian. But that you have to treat it all with a good bit of skepticism would be strange not to. On the other hand, it's not symmetric. Ukraine, again, is a little country. Russia is an enormous... The gap between Russia and Ukraine is as big that way as the one I told you about before between Russia and the United States. So you're looking at a colossus fighting a mouse, okay? So forget everything you know. The chances of the mouse winning, very slim. Everybody who pays attention knows that. Okay, the inequality is reduced when the West decides it's going to support this Ukraine. That was decided politically 10 years ago, in 2014. There was a government, when the Cold War ends, all the Eastern European countries that were allied with Russia, from Poland in the north to Bulgaria in the south, became, quote unquote, fully independent. They were no longer dependent on the Soviet Union, because one there. So all of their governments collapsed and were replaced by more or less right-wing governments. There were some exceptions, but basically it's a story. Ukraine among them. Took a little longer. Ukraine for a while had a leader who was very pro-Russian, openly so. He was overthrown. The Americans were involved in that, as they were in many of these. How important were they? Sometimes a lot, sometimes not so much. Ukraine quite a bit, but I don't think all of that is all that crucial. The big issue was, would these countries be independent? You know, like Switzerland, like Austria, sort of. Or would they be like the rest of Western Europe? And now here comes the dispute. The Russians claim, and they have good evidence, that they were promised, as part of the whole deal of all of that, that NATO, the anti-Russian organization of Western Europe and America, would not expand eastward. They would not try to bring in all of those countries from Poland in the north, Bulgaria in the south. And the Russians would therefore let Eastern Europe go. Now, you could ask the question, perfectly reasonable. Could the Russians have stopped it in any case? Probably not. So there's a little bit, you know, okay. But the promises were apparently made by a whole host of American and British diplomats, politicians, from the very top. And then in the years that followed, remember we're talking about stuff that happens in the early 1990s. In the years that followed, NATO did exactly what the claim is they promised not to do. Poland became part of NATO. They all. The Baltic states all of them became part of NATO. So if the NATO alliance moved across, and remember what that, I keep saying remember, you're young, maybe that's the wrong word. Those countries, that cordon from Poland in the north to Bulgaria in the south, that's a buffer zone. That's a group of countries with populations and geography separating Russia from Western Europe. And therefore, no military could come across there without the Russians having ample time and space and distance to protect themselves. And Russia has been invaded, repeated, right? Napoleon invaded Russia, World War I, they invaded Russia, World War II, Hitler invaded Russia. Worrying about invasions from Western Europe is a reasonable position for them to have. You may not like it, you may not agree with it, but given their history, wow. So they wanted that. So they're giving that up. Okay. May have happened anyway, but they're giving it up. So they lost that. And Mr. Putin, first it was Yeltsin and a couple of the other clowns they had there, that Mr. Putin is sitting there trying to be the president of a country, going through unspeakable difficulty. The collapse of their system would have been difficult for everybody, but they were also trying to reconstruct an economy. Very, very difficult. So he discovers he's the president. He's doing a passable job of recrafting an economy, but he looks like a weakling. I mean, all those countries are joining NATO, and he can't do anything. He can't stop it. He complains about it. He says, you're violated. We will not let you continue doing this. But it looks for all the world like he's a tin pot dictator telling you, I can't do it. But we did it, and you didn't do shit. Nothing. The last one left was Ukraine. And Ukraine had been more integrated into Russia. The others were more, Poland is its own thing, and Romania is its own thing. Romania has a Romance language. It doesn't have a Slavic language, stuff like that. Ukraine that's them. If you went to the most famous restaurant in New York City, serving Russian food for the last century, it's been called it's still there, the Russian Tea Room. It's on right next door to Carnegie Hall on 57th Street.
Is it good?
What?
Is it good?
If you like Russian food, I'm French. Our standards are very high.
Yeah.
Anyway, if you like Russian food, you can still go there. Okay, the most, if not the most famous dish, one of the two great dishes is called chicken Kiev. It's a particular way of preparing chicken, as was originally done in the Ukrainian city capital of Kiev. The Russian Tea Room featured that because that's as Russian as it gets. It's just so you understand. So for them to start saying, as they did, after they took all the other countries, we are now next going to go after Ukraine. And remember, they also tried 10 years ago to get a hold of Georgia, the state of Georgia, where Stalin came from, in the south of Russia there. That didn't work either. The Russian army came in and doing that. So it was clear that now the Russians were stiffening. You've taken all of that, but you're not going to come in and take what were literally parts of Russia. Georgia was a republic within the USSR, as Ukraine was. In the Russian Revolution, all of these places were given the status of independent republics. That's why it has that name, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. That's what USSR stands for. So they were much more integral. So now NATO is beginning to disconnect a piece of Russia from the rest of Russia. And Putin says, and he did it several times, we will not let you do that. You can't do it. And if you do it, remember, he had bullshit that, And, it was a cry wolf, he was doing it again. So I understand why the West didn't understand that he meant it. So they have what it's a long story, but they got rid of the pro-Russian government. They had a Maidan revolution. They had 2 or 3 people wanting to be. There was a comedian, a popular comedian in Ukraine, named Zelensky.
I've heard that name.
Yes. And they chose him. And the person who chose him was the woman in the State Department, forget her name right now, who quit recently because she's so upset about how it's going. But she brought Zelensky in. There's a cable that got quoted in WikiLeaks, bring in the comedian. She had a sense of humor. We're bringing in a comedian. They brought in the comedian. With good actor, he puts on the valiant struggler leader persona nicely. And they make announcements. They're working to bring Ukraine into NATO, and he says, okay, we're done. 2 days later, they invade. He had been building troops and moving them to the border, so people knew. The United States knew, weeks, maybe even months, what was going to happen. But they thought it was still bluffing. All right, now he's at the next level of bluff. It isn't just, he's moving the troops, but he moved the troops, and then 2 days after the last time, he did it. Okay, so now what? Now the United States is caught. They have a plan in their hallucination. They're going to carve Russia up. Russia's not going to be the big colossus it used to be. A country that goes from the Pacific Ocean all the way to the North Sea. That's always been the dream. Be very easy to manipulate 20 little republics like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and Azerbaijan and Armenia, all of which were republics before. So they want to carve it up into republics, and the more moderate ones say, no, we just want to slap Russia on the wrist. It's easy to do now. All of it was a mistake. They misunderstood the BRICS, misunderstood their own position in the world economy. They don't get it. They still don't. All right, so why do I say what I do? In the opening days of the war, I remembered the slogan, the truth is victimized, fine. So I don't believe anything. But that becomes very difficult. I pick up the same newspapers. I'm an American. I watch TV and all of this. So I say to myself, I've got to find somewhere somebody must be around who's not so far committed to one side or the other that they've lost their ability to do something. And I found it. And I'll be glad to tell you if you're interested.
Of course.
Okay, the man's name is Alexander Mercouris, Greek, Mercouris. Clearly sympathizes with Russia, no question about it. But it's not part of the Russian government, or I don't care, maybe he is. Secretly, I wouldn't know it. He certainly doesn't say so. He's on every single day for at least an hour. Every day, 7 days a week, and it has been throughout the war to this minute. I listened last night, just so you know. I don't ever do that. I've not been that way for anything. I don't have the time. But I don't catch him every night, but I listen very often. Why? Well, I've now learned. I was very skeptical at first. I wasn't sure what I could trust. His sympathy to the Russians has been fairly clear. But he's good. I think there are moments when I say, no, he hadn't got his right. By the way, when he talks about American politics, he's wrong. Terrible. He doesn't get that. He's based in London, and he's Greek. So I forgive him. When he talks about the United States, it's useless. But when he means well, he just He likes Trump, by the way. Likes Trump. But that's a little bit that Russian business. It's the neocons he hates. He hates them because they really are the enemy for him. And Trump is not them, so he likes Trump. I'm sure he'll adjust if Kamala Harris wins. But he's been reliable. The only reason I mention him is he has been reliable. And he's been reliable in the following sense, not for the details. I don't listen to the detail. He's full of details. It's kind of boring. This is the village that today was taken. The Ukrainians took this village. The Russians took the... I don't know the geography of Ukraine. Even if I knew the geography, I don't know what the meaning is of grabbing. It's like you said that they took White Plains, but not Yonkers. I actually know White Plains and Yonkers, but I wouldn't know what that meant. What I get from him is a sense of how the war is going. And he's been excellent on it. He said when the Ukrainian had a counteroffensive in 2023, he talked about the gains they made and what they did, and what the Russians did wrong. He was able to do that. But he has mostly shown me what I would have understood without knowing anything, which is this is a war between David and Goliath, except David doesn't have a slingshot. And so now his chances with Goliath, he had that slingshot, but without the slingshot, I mean, he's just little David. And then the big Goliath, it ain't gonna go well. And then that was my, but I'm no military strategist, I don't know that. But the economics that I got, I right away could say, whoa. In the early months, when Putin went to India, talked to Modi, and went to China and talked to Xi Jinping, and then I went, because I know how to do that, and I followed the oil and the gas trade. And where are the oil and gas lines being built? They had made a deal. And the deal was to move the oil and gas from Russia, sell it to China and India, and use the money to buy the products from India and China to replace those that they wouldn't buy from the West, because they didn't have the dollars to do it with. And then you saw it, and it all came together. The Chinese have become the manufacturer of the world. And if it's not Chinese, it's Vietnamese or Bangladeshis. Or they will sell to Russia. There's no problem. They want that business, they'll sell to Russia. And they make everything. The Russians are not going to be deprived of being unable to trade with Western Europe and America, because this is what Americans don't get. There's nothing made here that they don't make better and cheaper. And I use as an example, I don't know if, here's the economist hat. I'll give you an example. Electric vehicles, electric car, electric truck. The best electric cars and trucks in the world right now, as we speak, are made in China. It is the world leader in electric cars and trucks. And that's the future of cars and trucks. Okay, the Chinese have the best and the cheapest. Okay, so the whole world is making the transition for reasons of pollution and climate change, but also for reasons of economizing on oil and gas and all of that. They're making the switch. Where are they going to buy it? They go buy it in China. Russia can re-equip its entire fleet by buying from China. With what? With the money they get from selling China the oil and gas. It'll run those cars that are still running on oil and gas, plus heat people's homes and make the electricity and all the rest. You can't play the way you did before. Before the United States, if you go to Cuba, they're driving cars made in the 50s. Cobbled together, cannibalized Jeeps and stuff. Why? Because they can't replace it. But the rest of the world is different. It's like telling Israel, you can't do settler colonialism now. You could do it then, but you can't do it now.